Tonight, imagine standing on a cold, empty mountainside. More than 2,000 years ago, the wind moves freely across the land, carrying dust and silence over hills that seem to stretch without end. There are no walls here, no towers, no borders, only open land, and the quiet distance between one world and another. But over time, something begins to change. A small idea, almost invisible at first, that this endless space could be divided, that a line could be drawn, and not only with stone, but with human effort, human time, and human lives. And as we follow that idea tonight, we may begin to understand what it truly meant to build a boundary that would outlast the people who made it. Before we begin, take a moment to gently prepare yourself for rest. If you can dim the lights around you or turn them off completely, let the room become softer, quieter, more still. Close the door or settle into a place where you won't be disturbed. And then slowly lie down or lean back and allow your body to rest. Let your shoulders drop, your jaw soften, and your breathing become slow and natural. You don't need to focus. You don't need to follow every detail. And you don't need to think about anything at all. This is a slow history story, designed to help you rest. So, just listen, and let the story move gently around you. And if at any point you drift off, that's perfectly fine. That's exactly where this journey is meant to lead. Now, if you enjoy calm, slow stories like this, you can consider subscribing, so you'll always have a quiet place to return to at the end of the day. And if you're here tonight, you can leave a simple comment, even just, "I'm here," so I know you're part of this quiet space. And now, with everything settled, we can begin, far from the present moment, in a time before the wall existed, when the land stretched endlessly, and something unseen was slowly beginning to divide it. As this story begins, there is no wall, no stone rising across the mountains, no towers watching the horizon, and no clear line dividing one world from another. There is only land, wide and open, quietly stretching beneath the sky. And if you stand there for a moment, allowing your eyes to adjust to the distance, you may begin to notice something subtle. The land is not the same everywhere. To the south, the earth feels softer, and rivers move slowly across the plains, carrying water that returns again and again with the seasons, creating a rhythm that invites people to stay. Villages begin to grow here, not all at once, but gradually, as people learn to trust the land, planting seeds and waiting patiently through passing days, believing that something will return to them in time. Over time, paths begin to form between these places, and those paths slowly become roads, and those roads begin to connect lives into something that feels almost permanent. But to the north, everything changes. The ground becomes harder, drier, and the wind moves more freely, carrying dust across long distances without ever quite settling in one place. There are no fixed villages here, no fields waiting through the seasons, but instead there is movement, sometimes slow, sometimes sudden, always continuing. Groups of people travel with animals, following the rhythm of grass and water, never staying long enough for the land to fully hold them. And between these two worlds there is no clear boundary, no wall, no marker, only distance that stretches quietly between them. And yet, over time, that distance begins to feel different, not larger, but more meaningful. Because the people who live in these two lands begin to notice each other more. At first, it is only small encounters, shapes moving along the edge of sight, figures passing in the distance, present for a moment and then gone. Then, gradually, there are exchanges, simple things carried from one place to another, grain for leather, metal for animals, small objects that move quietly across the open land. And for a while, this is enough. But as the years pass, something begins to shift. Gradually, the encounters become less predictable, and what was once trade begins to carry tension, and what was once distance begins to feel like uncertainty. And uncertainty, once it appears, has a way of growing. In the southern lands, where fields now stretch further than before, people begin to depend on stability, where crops must grow and harvests must return, and life becomes tied to cycles that cannot easily be moved. But beyond that invisible line to the north, movement continues, freedom remains, and sometimes so does hunger. And when the land cannot provide, people begin to look elsewhere, not always with intention, not always with force, but often enough that those in the south begin to feel it. At first, it is only stories, quiet whispers carried between villages, of animals taken, of supplies missing, of distant shapes moving closer than before. Then, over time, those stories begin to repeat again and again, until they are no longer stories but expectations. And as this happens, something quiet begins to form in the minds of those who govern the land. Not a plan, not yet, but an idea that returns more often than before. A question, simple and persistent. What separates us from them? Is it distance that can be crossed? Is it land that can be moved through? Or is it something that has yet to be built? And once that question exists, it does not easily disappear, because distance can be crossed, and land can be traveled, but something built, something solid, might hold, might define, might protect. And so, without stone, without tools, and without even a clear design, the first version of the wall begins to exist, not on the land, but in the mind. A line imagined, long before it is ever drawn. And in the years that followed, that idea would slowly take shape, carried by rulers, shaped by fear, and eventually placed into the hands of countless people who would be asked to build it. But for now, the land remains open, and the wind continues to move freely across the mountains, untouched by any structure. And still, something has already begun. A quiet shift, almost invisible, slowly changing the shape of the land and the lives of those who live upon it. And as that shift continues, someone, somewhere, will decide that the line should no longer remain unseen. As this quiet tension continues, something begins to take shape across the land. Not all at once and not in a single place, but gradually, in small, scattered forms. At first, they are almost unnoticeable. Low ridges of earth, raised by hand, following the curves of hills and the edges of valleys, placed where the land already offers some kind of natural boundary. They are not yet walls in the way we might imagine them. They do not stretch endlessly across mountains, and they do not carry the weight of an empire. Instead, they are local, practical, and incomplete. But even in this early form, they carry an idea, a quiet attempt to define space, to separate what is inside from what is outside, and to give shape to something that was once only distance. In the years that followed, these early lines begin to appear in different regions, built by different states, each one responding to its own sense of uncertainty. Some are built along ridges, where the elevation provides a natural advantage. Others follow rivers, where movement is already guided by the flow of water. And in some places they are placed across open plains, where the land offers no protection at all, and everything must be created from the ground upward. The work itself is slow and repetitive. Earth is gathered, carried, and pressed into place. Layer by layer, the ground is shaped into something slightly higher, slightly firmer, something that resists the wind just a little more than before. And as this happens, the land begins to change. Not dramatically, not suddenly, but enough that those who live nearby begin to notice. A path that once moved freely now bends around a raised edge. A group traveling from the north pauses for a moment longer than before, observing something that was not there the last time they passed. And those who built these early structures begin to feel a quiet sense of difference. Not safety, not yet, but a boundary that can be seen. And once something can be seen, it can also be expanded. Over time, these scattered efforts begin to reflect a deeper shift in the way people think about land. It is no longer only a place to live or to move through. It becomes something to define, something to protect, something that belongs more clearly than before. And with that change in thinking, the scale of these early constructions begins to grow. In the period that would later be known as the time of the Warring States, different regions begin to act with greater urgency. Each state looks outward, not only toward its immediate neighbors, but toward the open lands beyond, where movement remains unpredictable and difficult to control. And so, the lines extend. What was once a short stretch of raised earth becomes a longer boundary, following the land for miles, then further still. In some places, the work is strengthened with wooden frames, holding the soil in place as it is pressed and shaped. In others, stones are gathered from nearby hills, added where the earth alone does not feel strong enough. But even as these structures grow, they remain separate. Each one built with its own purpose, its own direction, and its own understanding of what lies beyond. There is no single vision guiding them, no unified design, only a shared response to a feeling that continues to return, that the distance between worlds is no longer enough. And yet, these early walls are not absolute. They can be crossed, walked around, eroded by time and weather. They are not meant to be perfect barriers. They are something else, a signal, a presence, a quiet declaration that the land is no longer entirely open. And for those approaching from the north, they are a sign that something has changed. Not everywhere, not completely, but enough to be noticed. For those living to the south, they offer something different. A sense, however fragile, that there is now a limit to where uncertainty begins. But as this happens, another realization slowly emerges. A single wall, built in one place, is not enough, because the land is vast, and movement does not follow a single path. It shifts, adapts, and finds new ways through. And so, even as these early boundaries continue to expand, they reveal their own limitations. Gaps remain, connections do not yet exist. What one state builds, another does not extend. And what is strong in one place may be weak in another. And gradually, almost without intention, a larger idea begins to form, not just to build, but to connect, to take these scattered lines and imagine them as part of something greater, something continuous, something that does not end at the edge of one region, but continues beyond it. And once that idea appears, it begins to grow, quietly at first, and then with increasing clarity. Because if a boundary can exist in one place, it can exist in many. And if those boundaries can be joined, they might begin to shape the land in a way that has never been done before. But such a vision requires more than local effort, more than individual decisions. It requires a force that can see the land as a whole, not as separate parts. And in the years that followed, such a force would begin to rise, not from the edges, from within. A power that would look across all these scattered lines and begin to imagine something far more complete. Something that would not simply mark the land, but transform it. And as that power grows, the question will no longer be whether a wall can be built, but how far it can reach. As these scattered lines continue to stretch across the land, something else is beginning to change. Not along the edges, but deep within the heart of the world itself. At first, it is almost unnoticeable, a shift in power, quiet, gradual, moving from one region to another, as states that once stood apart begin to look beyond their own borders. They do not yet see the land as one, but they are beginning to imagine it. In the years that followed, this slow transformation begins to take a clearer form. Among the many states that rise and fall during this time, one begins to move differently, more steadily, more deliberately. Not always faster, but with a kind of consistency that does not fade. This is the state of Chin. It lies to the west, where the land is rugged and the air feels heavier, where mountains rise in layers and valleys narrow into long, controlled passages. It is not the most refined of the states, not the most admired. But over time, it becomes something else. Organized, disciplined, focused. And as this happens, its rulers begin to see the land in a way that others do not. Not as separate regions to defend, but as something that could be brought together. Gradually, almost quietly, Jin begins to expand. Not in sudden bursts, but in steady movements, absorbing one territory, then another, until the boundaries that once defined different states begin to fade. Walls that were built to divide begin to lose their purpose. Paths that once stopped at borders now continue without interruption. And over time, the idea of many lands begins to give way to something new, something unified. At the center of this transformation, there is a figure who will come to define it. Content, reference, Oisit, Index Easiu. He does not appear suddenly, nor does he arrive with spectacle. Instead, he emerges gradually as the one who will carry this growing vision to its final form. He inherits a system already in motion, a state already shaped by discipline and structure, and over time, he brings it to completion. By the year 221 before the present era, the separate states that once filled the land are no longer independent. They have been brought together, not loosely, but completely. And for the first time, the land is no longer divided by competing powers. It is held as one. But unity brings with it a different kind of awareness. Because when everything is connected, what lies beyond becomes more clearly defined. And once again, attention turns north. The open land is still there. The movement beyond the settled fields has not disappeared. If anything, it has become more noticeable. Because now there is something larger to protect. Not a single region, not a single border, but an entire system. And so, the question that once existed in fragments begins to return with greater clarity. What separates this unified land from everything beyond it? Distance is no longer enough, because distance can be crossed, and scattered wall, built by different states, are no longer enough either, because they do not connect, they do not hold as one, and gradually the idea begins to take shape again. Not as many walls, but as one, a single line extended across the land, not to divide states from each other, but to define the edge of the empire itself. And this time, the scale is different, because now there is a force capable of imagining the land as a whole, a force capable of organizing labor across vast distances, a force that can take scattered efforts and bring them together into something continuous. And as this thought settles into place, it begins to move outward, from the center toward the edges. Orders are given, not loudly, but with certainty. Resources begin to shift. People are called from villages, from fields, from places where life once followed a slower, more familiar rhythm. And the early walls, those scattered lines built by separate states, are no longer seen as finished structures. They become something else, foundations, fragments, waiting to be joined. And in the years that followed, these fragments will be gathered, extended, connected. What was once local will become imperial. What was once temporary will begin to feel permanent. And what was once an idea will begin to take physical form across mountains, across valleys, across distances that few had ever imagined crossing. But as this transformation begins, so does something else, because a wall of this scale cannot be built by vision alone. It requires something far more tangible: hands, bodies, time. And as the empire turns its attention outward, those elements will begin to gather, slowly at first, and then in numbers so vast that they will reshape not only the land, but the lives of those who are drawn into its making. And in the quiet space between decision and action, something begins to move. Not stone, not earth, not yet, but people. And as they begin to leave the places they once called home, the true weight of the wall is only just beginning to reveal itself. As this new empire settles into its shape, attention begins to move outward, not in haste and not with urgency, but with a steady awareness that now stretches further than before. Because when the land is held as one, its edges become clearer, and at those edges, something remains. To the north, the open land still moves as it always has. The wind travels without interruption, crossing hills and plains with a quiet persistence that never quite fades. There are no fixed borders here, no markers that remain in place long enough to define the ground beneath them. Only movement. And within that movement, lives continue as they have for generations. Groups travel slowly across the land, following grass, following water, following rhythms that cannot be held in one place. They do not build in the same way. They do not remain in the same way. And yet, they are not distant, not anymore, because as the empire expands, its reach extends closer to these shifting paths, and over time, the space between them begins to narrow. At first, it is only a matter of proximity. A village now stands where there was once only open land. A field stretches further than before, reaching into areas that were once untouched. And as this happens, encounters become more frequent, not always hostile, not always intentional, but present in ways that can no longer be ignored. A group of riders appears at the edge of sight. Then disappears before they can be followed. Tracks remain in the soil, leading toward places where nothing seems to have changed, and yet something clearly has. Livestock is unsettled. Supplies go missing, quietly, without explanation. And though these moments are small, they begin to gather. Gradually, they form a pattern. Not a constant threat, but an uncertainty that returns again and again. And for those living within the empire, uncertainty is difficult to accept, because life here has begun to depend on something else. Stability. Fields must remain where they are. Seasons must follow their course. Harvests must return, not once, but again and again. And when something disrupts that rhythm, even slightly, it begins to matter. Over time, reports begin to move inward, carried along roads that now connect distant regions, passed from one official to another, until they reach those who observe the land as a whole. The details are often simple. Small losses, brief encounters, of moments that do not last long enough to be called conflict, but not quiet enough to be ignored. And as these reports accumulate, they begin to shape a perception, not of a single event, but of a condition, something that exists just beyond the edge, persistent and difficult to define. And within the court of the emperor, this condition becomes a quiet subject of thought, not spoken loudly, not yet acted upon, but present, because the land is no longer divided. There is no other state to absorb the movement, no neighboring power to push the uncertainty outward. Everything now leads back to the same center, and so the question returns once more. What separates this world from what lies beyond it? Is it distance that can be crossed in time? Is it terrain that can be moved through with enough patience? Or is it something that must be made? Something that does not move, something that remains. As this question settles, the memory of earlier walls begins to resurface. Those scattered lines, built long before unity existed, once placed to define smaller territories. They were never complete, never connected, but they offered something, a sense, however temporary, that space could be shaped, that movement could be guided. And now, within a unified empire, that idea begins to return with greater clarity, not as an experiment, not as a local solution, but as something that might extend across the land itself, a boundary, not between states, but between ways of life, between stillness and movement, between what can be held and what cannot. And yet, even as this idea begins to take form, there's a quiet understanding that it will not be simple, because the land to the north does not resist in obvious ways. It does not stand still long enough to be defined. It shifts. It adapts. It finds paths where none seem to exist. And so, to create something that can meet it, the empire must think differently, not in terms of moments, but in terms of endurance, not in terms of reaction, but in terms of presence. A structure that does not chase, but waits, that does not move, but remains. And gradually, as this understanding deepens, the idea begins to settle into something more concrete. Not yet a command, not yet an action, but a direction. A quiet turning of attention toward the north, where the land remains open, and the edge of the empire is still undefined. And in that space, between awareness and decision, something begins to gather. Not stone, not earth, but intention. And as that intention grows, it will soon begin to take shape in a way that will draw countless lives toward it. and begin the long, unbroken process of turning distance into a line. As this quiet intention continues to gather, it begins slowly to take on a different weight. No longer only a question, no longer only an idea, but something that moves closer to action. Within the center of the empire, where decisions are shaped and carried outward, the thought of a boundary has now settled into place. It is not spoken of as something uncertain. It is considered, measured, and gradually accepted. Because the land is no longer divided, there are no longer many rulers deciding many things. There is only one. Content reference, Y-site, Index 0. And under his rule, what is imagined can be carried across vast distances, not as suggestion, but as direction. At first, the movement is subtle. Messengers begin to travel along the roads that now connect the empire, carrying words that are precise and deliberate. Officials receive them in quiet chambers, reading not with surprise but with understanding, because the idea has already been forming. Now it is simply being given shape. The early walls, those scattered fragments built in years before unity, are no longer seen as remnants of a divided past. They are recognized as beginnings and foundations waiting to be extended, and gradually orders begin to take form, not in a single moment, but in a sequence that unfolds across time. Repair what already exists, strengthen what has weakened, extend what has ended too soon, and where nothing stands, begin. As this happens, the responsibility does not fall on one place alone. It moves outward, from the center to the edges, reaching provinces, regions, and distant territories that now share the same direction. And with that direction comes something else. People. At first, the numbers are small. Groups of workers, drawn from nearby areas, asked to assist in rebuilding sections that have long been worn by wind and time. They gather soil. They shape the ground. They follow instructions that are simple but unending. And then, gradually, the scale begins to change. More hands are needed, more bodies, more time. Because what is being imagined is no longer a series of walls. It is a continuous line. And a continuous line requires continuity of effort across distances that few have ever crossed in a single journey. So, the call spreads. From villages in the south, where fields have just begun to settle into reliable cycles, to towns further inland, where life moves at a slower, more predictable pace. People are asked to leave, not all at once, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty that this is now part of what is required. Some go as laborers, fulfilling obligations that bind them to the state. Some go as soldiers, sent not only to defend, but to build. And some go as punishment, taken from places where mistakes have already cost them their freedom. Different paths leading to the same destination. And as they begin to arrive at the northern edges, the land meets them in silence. There are no markers waiting for them, no finished structures rising in the distance, only fragments, lines that begin and then disappear, sections that rise briefly and then fall back into the shape of the earth. And it is here, in these incomplete places, that the work begins. Not with speed, not with force, but with repetition. Soil is gathered from the ground beneath their feet, carried in baskets, in arms, across short distances that repeat again and again. Frames are set. Earth is poured between them. And then, slowly, deliberately, it is pressed, layer by layer, each one thin, each one requiring the same movement, the same effort, the same time. And as this continues, the land begins to change, not dramatically, not in a way that can be seen from afar, but in small, accumulating ways. A ridge becomes slightly higher, a line becomes slightly longer. A shape begins to hold, and with each passing day, that shape becomes more defined. But the work does not end, because as one section begins to take form, another waits, and beyond that, another still. The distance does not shorten, it extends, and the effort required to meet it extends as well. Over time, those who work along these early stretches begin to understand something that was not clear before. This is not a task with a clear end. There is no moment when it will be complete in the way a house is complete, or a road is complete, because the line itself continues. It moves across mountains, descends into valleys, crosses open plains, and follows paths that shift with the land. And so the work must continue, not until it is finished, but as long as it is needed. And that need is difficult to measure, because it is not tied to a single event. It is tied to a condition, a presence beyond the edge that does not disappear. And as long as that presence remains, so too will the effort to define it. And gradually, this understanding settles into the rhythm of the work. Each movement becomes part of something larger. Each day becomes one of many, and each person becomes one of countless others, moving in the same way, toward the same purpose, without ever seeing the full shape of what they are building. And as this continues, the command that began as a quiet direction becomes something else, not louder, not more urgent, but more constant, a presence that does not fade, carried through instructions, through labor, through time. And across the northern edge of the empire, the first true stretches of the wall begin to rise, not as scattered fragments, but as something that begins to connect. And as those connections form, so does something else. A realization, still quiet, still unspoken, that what is being built here will demand more than effort, more than skill, more than time. It will ask for something deeper, something carried not in the hands, but in the body itself. And as more people begin to arrive, drawn from places far from this shifting edge, that cost will slowly begin to reveal itself. As this movement begins, it does not feel like a single moment. There is no clear day when everything changes all at once. No sudden shift that separates the past from what is to come. Instead, it happens gradually. A message arrives in a village, carried along the roads that now connect distant parts of the empire. It is read aloud, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a kind of quiet certainty that leaves little room for question. Names are spoken, not many at first, just enough to begin. And those who hear their names step forward, not quickly, but with a stillness that settles into the air around them. There is no confusion about what this means. The work has already begun elsewhere. And now, it is reaching here. In the days that follow, preparations are simple. There is little to gather. A piece of cloth, a small amount of food, perhaps something carried not for use, but for memory. No one knows how long they will be gone, so nothing is packed with certainty, only with hope. And when the time comes, they leave. Not in large groups, but in small lines that form at the edge of the village. Some turn back once, briefly, not to hold on to what they see, but to recognize it one last time. The fields, the paths, the quiet shapes of homes that have always been there, and then they begin to walk. The journey north is not fast. It moves at the pace of the body, step after step, day after day. The land changes slowly beneath them. Soft ground becomes harder. Green fades into dust, the air grows drier, and the wind begins to move with greater force. At night, they rest where they can, on open ground, or near places where others have passed before. There are no structures waiting for them, no clear destination that appears on the horizon, only the direction, and the understanding that they are not the only ones moving this way. Over time, they begin to notice others, groups from different regions, walking along paths that slowly begin to merge. Their clothing is not the same. Their voices carry different tones, but their movement is shared. They are all heading toward the same edge, and as these paths come together, something begins to form. Not a community, not yet, but a presence, a quiet gathering of people who did not choose to meet, but now move side by side. Some speak, most do not, because there is little to say that has not already been understood. The journey continues, and days stretch into longer sequences, measured not by events but by repetition, walking, resting, continuing again. And eventually, the land begins to change once more. The horizon becomes less open. The ground rises and falls in uneven ways. And ahead, something appears. At first, it is difficult to recognize. Just a line that does not belong to the natural shape of the land. Then, as they move closer, it becomes clearer. Earth that has been lifted, shaped, held in place by effort that still lingers in its form. It is not continuous, not yet. Sections rise and then fall away. Gaps stretch between them, but it is enough to understand. This is where the work happens, and as they arrive, there is no pause, no moment of transition. They are guided, quietly, toward places where others are already moving. There are no formal introductions, no explanations, only the continuation of something that has already begun. Hands are placed into the rhythm of the work. Soil is gathered, carried, set into place. At first, the body resists. Movements feel unfamiliar. The weight is awkward. The repetition is difficult to settle into. But over time, something changes. Not in the work, but in the body itself. It begins to adapt. Muscles learn the motion. Breathing finds a pattern. The distance between effort and exhaustion becomes more predictable. And with that predictability comes a kind of quiet endurance. Days begin before the light fully settles over the land, and they continue until the body can no longer maintain the same rhythm. There is no clear signal to stop, only a gradual slowing as one movement becomes harder to repeat. Food is simple, rest is brief, and then the cycle begins again. Over time, the sense of beginning and ending begins to fade. There is only continuation. Each layer of earth pressed into place feels the same as the one before it. Each section of ground resembles the last, and slowly, the awareness of distance begins to disappear, because the line they are building extends beyond what they can see. They do not know where it began. They do not know where it will end. They only know the part that exists in front of them, and the movement required to shape it. Around them, others move in the same way, different faces, different lives, all drawn into the same rhythm. Some are soldiers, their presence marked by the way they stand when they pause. Some are laborers, their hands already shaped by years of work before this. and some carry a different stillness. Those who have been sent here not by duty, but by punishment. But within the work, these differences begin to soften, because the movement is the same, the weight is the same, the repetition is the same. And gradually, something begins to settle across the entire space. Not silence, but a pattern. The sound of earth being pressed, the shift of feet against the ground, the quiet exhale of effort, repeated again and again. And as this pattern continues, the wall begins to rise, not quickly, not dramatically, but steadily. And with each layer that is added, something else is slowly taken, not all at once, not in a way that can be measured in a single moment, but over time, through repetition, through endurance, through the quiet passing of days that no longer feel separate from one another. And as more people arrive, drawn from places further and further away, this pattern expands. The line grows longer, the rhythm becomes larger, and the space between those who once lived separate lives begins to close. Not through choice, but through shared motion. And in that motion, something begins to change, not in the wall, but in the people themselves. Because as the work continues, and the days begin to blur into one another, the question of when it will end slowly begins to fade, replaced by something else, something quieter, something heavier, the understanding that for now, this is simply where they are. And as that understanding settles, the work continues, unbroken, unhurried, and without a clear end in sight. And in the days that follow, the body will begin to feel this rhythm more deeply, not only in movement, but in weight, in exhaustion, and in the quiet limits of what it can endure. As the days continue to gather, the work begins to take on a different quality. It is no longer new, no longer unfamiliar. Instead, it settles into something quieter, something that does not need to be explained, because it repeats itself with such consistency that the body begins to understand it without thought. A day here does not begin with a clear moment. There is no single signal that marks its start. Light slowly returns to the sky, and with it, movement begins again. Not suddenly, but in small shifts. A hand reaching for a tool. A body adjusting against the ground. A breath drawn more deeply than before. And then the work resumes. Soil is gathered, not in haste, but with a steady rhythm that has already been learned. It is lifted, carried, and placed into wooden frames that hold its shape just long enough for the next step to begin. Then comes the pressing. Slow, repeated, and deliberate. A weighted tool rises and falls and rises again, each movement following the last so closely that the space between them begins to disappear. Over time, the sound becomes familiar, a soft, dull impact, repeated again and again, carried across the ground in patterns that overlap and continue without clear beginning or end. It is not loud, not sharp, but constant. And because it is constant, it begins to shape more than the earth beneath it. It begins to shape the day itself. There are no hours marked in a way that can be easily counted. No clear divisions that separate morning from afternoon. Instead, time is felt through repetition, through the number of times the tool is lifted, through the distance walked with weight carried across the shoulders, through the gradual slowing of the body as effort accumulates. At first, the body resists this pattern. Muscles tighten, movements feel heavy, uneven, uncertain. But gradually, almost without awareness, something changes. The body begins to conserve. it learns where to hold strength and where to release it. Breathing becomes measured, not forced, not shallow, but steady enough to continue without interruption. And with that adjustment, the work becomes possible in a different way, not easier, but more continuous. Around them, others move within the same pattern. Different faces, different origins, but the same motion repeated again and again. Some carry baskets of earth across short distances, their steps slow and deliberate, their balance shaped by the weight they have learned to hold. Others remain in place, pressing the soil into form, their movements smaller but no less demanding, repeated so often that they begin to feel almost mechanical. And between these roles, there is a quiet exchange. Not spoken, but understood, because each movement depends on another, and if one slows too much, the pattern shifts, so the rhythm holds them together, not by instruction, but by necessity. As this continues, the wall begins to take on a clearer shape. Layer by layer, the earth rises, each section slightly higher than before, each surface more defined, more resistant to the wind that moves across it. But the change is slow, so slow that it can only be noticed when looking back, not in the moment. And so, for those within the work, the sense of progress is difficult to hold. There is only the next movement, the next lift, the next step, the next impact, and then another. As the sun moves across the sky, though it is rarely followed closely, the light shifts in ways that are felt more than seen. Shadows lengthen, the air cools slightly, and with that change, the body begins to respond. Not by stopping, but by slowing. Movements that were steady become heavier. Steps take longer to begin, the tool rises with more effort, and falls with less force. And gradually, the rhythm begins to soften, until finally, it breaks. Not with a signal, not with a command, but with a quiet understanding shared across the space. That, for now, it is enough. Food is taken in small portions, simple, without variety, consumed not for comfort, but for continuation. Water is passed carefully. Rest is brief, and yet, even in rest, the body does not fully leave the work, because the rhythm remains, faint but present, carried in the arms, in the shoulders, in the steady echo of movement that continues even when the body is still. And when the light fades further, and the land begins to cool beneath the open sky, silence does not fully return, because the work does not disappear, it only pauses, and in that pause, something else becomes clearer. The weight, not only of the earth that has been moved, but of the repetition itself, because what is difficult here is not a single effort, not a single day, but the accumulation, the quiet gathering of motion, repeated so many times that it begins to shape the body in ways that are not easily undone. Hands become roughened, skin tightens. Movements lose their variation, becoming narrower, more efficient, more controlled. And with that change, something else begins to fade, not memory, not entirely, but the sharpness of where one day ends and another begins. Because when each day follows the same pattern, they begin to blend. And in that blending, time becomes something softer, less defined, harder to measure, only felt through the body, and the limits it slowly begins to approach. And as more days pass, and more layers are added to the rising line of earth, the rhythm deepens. It settles into something that no longer needs to be learned, only endured. And within that endurance, a quiet question begins to form, not spoken, not shared, but present, beneath the movement. how long can this continue? Not in distance, not in space, but in the body itself. And as that question remains unanswered and without clear end, the work continues, steady, unbroken, and carried forward, one movement at a time, into the next day, and the next, and the next. As the rhythm of work continues, something begins to settle more deeply into the space around it. Not only movement, not only effort, but sound. At first, it is barely noticed, just a soft impact, repeated as earth is pressed into place. A dull, steady tone, without sharpness, without variation. But over time, as more people move within the same pattern, that sound begins to gather. It spreads across the ground in overlapping waves, each movement adding to the next, until the space is filled not with noise, but with a kind of quiet consistency. The lifting of tools, the fall of weight against packed soil, the shifting of feet across dry ground, and the slow measured breath that follows each effort. None of these sounds stand apart. They do not call attention to themselves. Instead, they blend. And in that blending, they form something continuous, a rhythm that does not begin and does not end, only continues. For those who have just arrived, this sound feels distant, something outside the body, something that exists around them, but not yet within. But gradually, as the movements repeat, as the same actions return again and again, and that distance begins to close, the sound moves closer, until it is no longer something that is heard, but something that is felt. In the hands, as the tool makes contact. In the arms, as the motion repeats. In the chest, where breath adjusts itself to match the pattern. And over time, the boundary between the body and the work begins to soften, because the rhythm does not ask for attention. It does not require thought. It simply continues, and the body, slowly, begins to follow. There is no need to count, no need to measure. The repetition becomes its own measure, one movement leading to the next, without interruption, without decision. And in that continuity, something changes. Not suddenly, not in a way that can be easily seen, but in the way effort is carried. At first, each movement feels separate. Each lift, each step, each impact, experienced as its own moment. But gradually, those moments begin to connect. They stretch into one another, forming longer sequences that feel less like individual actions and more like a single extended motion. And as that happens, the sense of strain begins to shift, not disappearing, but becoming something that moves differently through the body, less sharp, more constant, a steady presence rather than a series of peaks. Around them, others move within the same pattern. Their movements are not identical, but they align, not by instruction, but by repetition. And in that alignment, the rhythm strengthens, because it is no longer held by one body alone. It is carried by many, each one adding to the continuity, each one sustaining the motion beyond what any single person could maintain. And so, the work continues, not driven by urgency, but by persistence. The wall rises slowly, so slowly that it resists attention. There is no moment when it suddenly becomes something large, only a gradual accumulation, layer upon layer, extending further across the land. And yet, within that slow change, something else becomes more apparent. The body has limits. At first, those limits are reached quickly. Fatigue arrives early. Strength fades without warning. But over time, the body adjusts. It learns to move within its limits rather than against them. Effort becomes measured. Energy is held and released in smaller amounts. And in that adjustment, endurance begins to take form, not as strength, not as power, but as continuation, the ability to remain within the rhythm without breaking from it. And this endurance, once it appears, begins to carry the work forward in a different way, because it is not dependent on a single moment of effort. It is built through repetition, through the quiet acceptance of movement that does not change. And as the days pass, this acceptance deepens. The question of how long the work will continue becomes less immediate, not because it has been answered, but because it no longer shapes each moment. There is only the next movement, the next sound, the next contact between earth and tool, and then another and another. Even when the body begins to slow, the rhythm remains, carried not by force, but by habit. And when one movement falters, another takes its place. Because the work does not belong to one person, it continues through all of them. And so, even as individuals reach their limits, the rhythm does not break. It adjusts, it absorbs, it continues. And within that continuation, something begins to fade. Not effort, not entirely, but the sense of separation between one moment and the next. Time becomes less distinct. Hours do not stand apart. Days do not hold clear edges. They move into one another, like the repeated sound of earth being pressed, blending into a single, extended presence. And in that presence, the body remains, working, breathing, continuing. Not toward an end that can be seen, but within a process that does not yet reveal its conclusion. And as this continues, as the sound settles deeper into the ground and into the bodies that carry it, another realization begins to form. Quiet, but persistent. That what is being shaped here is not only the land, but the limits of endurance itself. And as those limits are approached, again and again, they do not always hold, because the body, even as it adapts, cannot continue without cost. And in the days that follow, that cost will begin to show itself, not in the rhythm, but in the moments, when the rhythm can no longer be maintained. As this rhythm continues, day after day, and then beyond what can easily be counted, something begins to change, not in the wall, not in the sound, but in the body itself. At first, the changes are small, so small that they pass without notice. A movement that takes slightly longer to begin. A breath that does not return as smoothly as before. A moment of stillness that lingers just a little beyond the rhythm. And then the work continues. Because the rhythm does not wait. It does not pause to adjust. It moves forward, steady, unchanged, carried by those who are still able to follow it. And for a time, the body finds a way to remain within it, even as the signs begin to gather. Hands that once closed firmly around tools now hold them with less certainty. Steps that once felt balanced begin to shift, slightly uneven against the ground. The weight of earth, carried again and again, begins to settle deeper into the shoulders, not as effort alone, but as something that remains even when the load is set down. And yet, these changes do not stop the work. They move alongside it, quiet, unspoken, shared by many, but rarely acknowledged, because to pause is to fall behind the rhythm. And to fall behind the rhythm is to feel its absence, which over time becomes more difficult than the work itself. So the movements continue. Lift, carry, press, again and again and again, until gradually the body begins to reach a different kind of limit. Not the sharp exhaustion of a single day, but something deeper. A slowing that cannot be easily corrected. A heaviness that does not lift with rest. A quiet resistance within the muscles, as if each movement must now pass through something that was not there before. At first, those around them adjust. The rhythm shifts slightly. A small space opens, allowing the movement to continue without breaking. Because the work is shared. And within that sharing, there is a kind of unspoken support. But the rhythm can only bend so far, because it is held by many, not shaped for one. And as the body continues to weaken, that small space begins to close. Movements fall out of alignment. The tool rises, but does not fall with the same force. The soil is carried, but set down with less precision. The pattern begins to loosen, not everywhere, not all at once, but in small places where the body can no longer keep pace. And then there are moments, brief, almost still, where the movement stops, not by choice, not by decision, but because it cannot continue in that instant. A hand remains lowered, a step is not taken, a breath does not return quickly enough. And in those moments, the rhythm moves on. It does not wait, it does not turn back. It continues, carried by others, pressing forward along the line. For those who pause, the space around them changes. The sound becomes distant. The steady pattern that once surrounded them now moves slightly ahead, no longer fully enclosing them. And for a brief time, there is stillness, not rest, but separation. And within that separation, the body reveals what has been building over time, the weight that has settled into the limbs, the strain that has moved beyond muscle into something deeper, the quiet exhaustion that no longer fades with a single night. Around them, others continue to move. Not with indifference, but with necessity. Because the work does not belong to any one person. It continues through all who remain within the rhythm. And so, those who cannot return to it are gradually left behind. Not abruptly, not in a way that draws attention, but in the same quiet manner in which everything here unfolds, a shift in position. A space that does not close, a presence that fades from the pattern. And as this happens, the line continues to grow, unaffected in its direction, unchanged in its purpose, because the wall does not pause. It does not slow in response to the limits of the body. It continues, as long as there are those who can carry it forward. And gradually, the understanding of this becomes clearer. Not through words, but through repetition. Through the quiet observation of what happens when the rhythm can no longer be held. And as this understanding settles, something changes within those who remain. Movements become more careful. Not slower, but more measured. Energy is preserved where it can be. Effort is distributed more evenly across the body, because the limit is no longer abstract. It has been seen, felt, recognized, not as a distant possibility, but as something that exists within the work itself. And yet, even with this awareness, the rhythm continues, because it must, and because stopping is not part of what has been set into motion. The line extends, the earth rises, the sound returns, steady, continuous, carried by those who remain within its pattern. And over time, the places where the rhythm has broken begin to disappear, not in memory, but in presence, because the work moves forward, leaving behind only the space where something once was. And as more days pass, and more bodies move through the same cycle of effort and exhaustion, that space begins to grow, not visible from afar, not marked in any way that can be easily seen, but present in the quiet understanding shared among those who continue, that the wall is rising, not only from earth, but from the gradual giving way of the bodies that build it. And as this continues, another layer of the work begins to reveal itself. Not in the movement, not in the sound, but in the cost that is no longer hidden. And in the days that follow, that cost will become harder to ignore as the line grows longer and the number of those who can carry it forward begins to change. As the work continue and the rhythm carries forward through those who remain within it, the wall begins to take on a form that can be seen more clearly, not from a single point, not all at once, but in fragments connected by effort, extending across the land in ways that were once only imagined. From a distance, it appears as a faint line, uneven, interrupted, rising and falling with the shape of the terrain. In some places it stands higher, more defined, its surface pressed firm by countless repeated movements. In others it lowers, softening back into the earth, as if the land itself has begun to reclaim it. But despite these variations, something is changing. The line is no longer isolated. It no longer belongs to one place alone. It begins to stretch further than before, across hills, across shallow valleys, across ground that once held no sign of division, and with each extension, the idea behind it becomes more visible. This is not a structure meant to remain still in one place. It is something that moves not in motion, but in reach. It follows the land, adapts to it, extends where it must, pauses where it can, and then continues again. For those working along its length, this growing distance is not experienced as a single form. They do not see the wall as it will one day be understood. They see only sections, the part in front of them, the ground beneath their feet, the movement required to shape it. And yet, even without seeing the whole, they begin to sense its scale, not through sight, but through continuation, because no matter how much is built, there is always more. Another stretch waiting to be raised, another gap waiting to be filled, another direction extending beyond what can be reached in a single day, or even many. And as this understanding deepens, the nature of the work begins to shift. It is no longer tied to completion. There is no clear moment when it will be finished. Instead, it becomes something ongoing, a process rather than a project. And within that process, the rhythm continues to hold. But it is not the same everywhere. Along some sections, the ground is firm, and the work moves steadily, each layer settling into place with relative ease. In others, the soil resists. It crumbles. It shifts under pressure. It must be gathered again and again, shaped and reshaped before it can hold. And this variation, subtle at first, begins to affect the pace. Not enough to stop the work, but enough to remind those within it that the land is not passive. It responds, it changes, it requires adjustment. And so, the rhythm adapts, slightly, quietly, without breaking. Tools are lifted at different angles. Steps are placed with more care. Movements that once felt uniform begin to carry small differences, shaped by the ground beneath them. And yet, even with these changes, the wall continues to grow, because the effort does not come from one place alone. It is spread. distributed across distances that cannot be easily measured. And along those distances, more people continue to arrive, drawn from regions further away, called into the same pattern, placed into the same movement. They take the place of those who have slowed, those who have fallen out of rhythm, those who no longer stand within the line. And so, the work does not diminish. It renews itself, not by choice, but by continuation. And with each new group that joins, the line extends further, reaching into spaces that were once untouched, marking ground that had no previous boundary. And still, the distance remains, because no matter how far the wall stretches, the land beyond it does not disappear. To the north, movement continues, unbound, uncontained. The wind still crosses the plains without resistance. Paths still form and vanish across the open ground. And the presence that first gave rise to the idea of the wall remains. Not constant, not always visible, but enough. Enough to keep the attention of the empire fixed on the edge, and so the work continues. Not as a response to a single moment, but as an answer to something that does not fully resolve, a condition that remains just beyond reach. And within that condition, the wall grows, not to end the distance, but to define it. And as more sections begin to connect, something else begins to take form. A sense, however incomplete, that the line is becoming something continuous, that the scattered efforts of the past are slowly being drawn together into a single direction. And once that direction becomes clear, it begins to shape not only the land, but the system that supports it. Because a line of this scale cannot exist through labor alone. It requires something more, something that moves alongside the work, unseen but essential. Food, tools, materials, all carried across distances that grow longer with each passing day. And as the wall extends, so too does the effort required to sustain it. And in the days that follow, that effort will begin to take on a different form. Not in the hands that build, but in the paths that feed the work itself. And as those paths stretch further into the land, the cost of distance will begin to reveal itself in a new way. As the wall continues to extend and the rhythm of labor carries it forward across the land, another movement begins to grow alongside it. Less visible, less immediate, but no less essential. Because the work, for all its repetition, cannot continue on effort alone. It must be sustained, and what sustains it must travel. At first, this need is simple. Food is brought from nearby places, carried over short distances, enough to support the early stages of work. But as the line stretches further, those distances begin to change. The wall moves outward, away from settled land, away from fields that produce in steady cycles, and gradually, the space between where food is grown and where it is needed begins to widen. At first, this widening is manageable. Small groups carry what they can, baskets filled with grain, bundles of dried food, measured carefully, intended to last through the journey. They move along paths that are still familiar, routes that follow rivers, or pass through known settlements. But over time, those paths become longer, less certain. The land between becomes more open, more exposed, more difficult to move through without pause. And so, the act of carrying food becomes something else, not a simple extension of the work, but its own kind of labor. A journey that repeats again and again across increasing distance. Those who carry supplies move differently. Their rhythm is not shaped by the lifting and pressing of earth, but by the weight they must sustain over time. Step after step, across ground that offers little variation, their movement becomes measured. Not fast, not slow, but steady enough to continue. Because what they carry cannot be easily replaced, and the distance they travel does not shorten, it grows. Over time, animals are brought into this movement. Pack animals, able to carry more than a single person, used to extend the reach of what can be delivered. But even with this addition, the effort does not lessen, because what is gained in capacity is often lost in distance. Paths stretch further, journeys take longer, and the weight of what is carried must now sustain both the destination and the journey itself. And this is where something begins to shift, not in the visible work of the wall, but in the balance between what is sent and what arrives. At the beginning of each journey, the load is full, measured, carefully prepared. But as the days pass and the path continues, that load begins to change. Not suddenly, not in a way that can be easily seen at first, but gradually through the simple act of survival. Those who carry the food must also eat. The animals that bear the weight must also be fed. Water must be found or carried. Energy must be maintained if the journey is to continue. And so, what is meant for the destination is slowly used along the way, not by waste, not by loss, but by necessity. And over time, the distance reveals its cost. A journey that begins with abundance arrives with far less. The effort required to deliver food begins to match, and sometimes exceed, the value of what is delivered. And yet, the movement continues, because the work depends on it, and those who labor along the wall cannot continue without what arrives. Even if what arrives is less than what was sent, and so, more is gathered, more is carried, more people are drawn into the task, not only to build, but to sustain the building. And gradually, a second rhythm forms, not at the wall itself, but along the paths that lead to it. A rhythm of movement, of carrying, of returning, and beginning again. And like the rhythm of labor, it does not pause, it continues as long as the work continues. Over time, these two rhythms begin to depend on each other. The wall cannot rise without food, and the food cannot reach its destination without the effort to carry it. And in this quiet exchange, something becomes clear. The wall is not only made of earth, it is shaped by distance, by the length of the journey required to sustain it, by the space between where life is stable and where it is consumed. And as that space grows, so too does the cost. Not always visible, not always recorded, but present in every step taken across the land, in every load that grows lighter before it arrives, in every journey that must begin again, because the last was not enough. And for those who carry this burden, the experience is different from the work of building. There is no structure rising in front of them, no visible progress to mark the passing of time. Only distance, unchanging, repeated. And within that repetition, the body begins to feel the weight in a different way, not in the strain of lifting, but in the endurance of carrying. A constant pressure that does not release, even when the load is set down. A fatigue that builds, not from force, but from duration. And as this continues, the line between effort and exhaustion begins to soften, because there is no moment when the work is complete. Only a return, a brief rest, and then the journey again. And in that cycle, the cost of distance becomes something that cannot be ignored. Not because it is sudden, but because it is constant. And as the wall stretches further into the north, drawing more people, more effort, more movement into its path, the system that sustains it must stretch as well. And in the days that follow, that system will begin to reach its limits. Not in the wall, but in the ability to continue feeding it. And as those limits are approached, the balance between what is built and what can be sustained will begin to shift. Quietly, but in ways that will shape everything that comes next. As the paths that feed the wall continue to stretch, and the journeys grow longer with each passing cycle, something begins to change in a way that can no longer remain unnoticed. At first, it is subtle. A delivery arrives later than expected, the load smaller than before, the measures reduced in ways that are not immediately explained. Those who receive it do not question it openly. They adjust. They divide what remains. They continue. Because the rhythm of the work does not pause to consider why something is less. It simply moves forward with what is available. And yet, as the days pass, these moments begin to repeat. Again and again and again. Not always in the same place, not always at the same time, but often enough that they begin to form a pattern. The journeys take longer, the loads grow lighter, the distance, once measured only in space, begins to reveal itself in absence. And gradually, the understanding begins to settle, not through words, not through instruction, but through experience. What is sent does not fully arrive. What is carried does not remain whole, and what is needed continues to grow. Along the routes that stretch between the inner lands and the northern edge, the movement becomes more difficult to sustain. Those who travel these paths begin to feel the strain more deeply, not only in the body, but in the uncertainty of the journey itself, because each step forward requires something to be given up, a portion of what is carried, a measure of what was meant for another, not taken lightly, not taken without awareness, but taken because it must be. And over time, this quiet exchange begins to shape the entire system. More food is gathered, more people are sent, more effort is directed toward sustaining the flow. And yet, the result does not change. The distance remains, the loss continues, and the balance between what is needed and what can be delivered begins to shift. Not abruptly, not in a way that causes immediate disruption, but slowly, steadily, in a direction that cannot easily be reversed. At the wall, those who work begin to feel this shift, not as a single moment of lack, but as a gradual thinning. Meals become smaller. Intervals between them grow longer. Energy must be used more carefully, distributed across the day in ways that were not required before. And within this adjustment, the rhythm begins to change, not in its structure, but in its weight. Each movement carries more effort. Each repetition draws more from the body, and the space between strength and exhaustion becomes narrower. For those who carry supplies, the journey becomes something else entirely. No longer a path that connects two places, but a cycle that consumes itself. A journey where the act of sustaining movement reduces what can be delivered. And in that cycle, the sense of purpose becomes more difficult to hold, because the distance does not respond, it does not shorten, it does not yield. It simply remains, stretching outward, unchanged by the effort required to cross it. And yet, the movement continues. Because it must, because the wall continues, and because those who work along its length cannot do so without what is brought to them. And so, more people are drawn into the system. From villages further inland, from places where life once followed a slower rhythm, they are asked to leave, to carry, to sustain something they may never see in full. Some travel willingly, bound by duty. Others are sent, bound by obligation. And some are taken from circumstances that leave them no choice at all. Different paths, leading into the same movement, and within that movement, the cost begins to spread. Not only across distance, but across lives. Because as more effort is directed toward sustaining the work, less remains for those who once depended on that same effort in other ways. Fields are left unattended, harvests are delayed, the balance that once held steady begins to shift, quietly, gradually, but with growing weight. And within the system itself, the shift becomes more difficult to ignore, because the wall is no longer only a line of earth rising across the land. It is a structure that draws from everything around it, from labor, from movement, from time, and now, increasingly, from the limits of what can be sustained. And as those limits are approached, the question begins to change. No longer only how far the wall can extend, but how much can be given to continue extending it. And in the days that follow, that question will begin to press more firmly against the structure of the empire itself. Not in open conflict, not in sudden collapse, but in quiet strain, felt across distances, carried in bodies, and reflected in the slow shift of a system that must now hold more than it was ever meant to bear. And as this strain deepens, something else begins to emerge, not yet visible, not yet fully formed, but present beneath the surface of the work. A sense that what is being built is asking for more than the land, and more than the body. It is asking for something that cannot continue without consequence. And as that realization begins to take shape, the wall will continue to rise, but the cost will no longer remain hidden within the rhythm. It will begin to appear in the lives that surround it. As the strain within the system becomes more apparent, it does not lead to sudden change. There is no pause in the work, no moment when the wall is set aside to reconsider what it requires. Instead, the response takes a different form, not in the movement of bodies, but in the structure that directs them. Because the empire, now unified, does not rely on chance. It relies on order, on systems that can extend across distance and hold their shape even as conditions begin to shift. And within that order, labor is not simply requested, it is defined, measured, assigned. In the years that follow, what began as scattered effort begins to take on a more precise form. Each region is given responsibility. Each household becomes part of a structure that reaches far beyond its own boundaries. And gradually, the idea of service to the state becomes something that is no longer abstract. It is counted, a portion of life set aside, not for personal use, but for the work of the empire. For many, this takes the form of time, a year, given not in a single moment, but through days that are gathered and directed toward places far from where they began. And when that time is called, it must be fulfilled, not with urgency, not with force that is visible at every step, but with a certainty that does not leave space for refusal. Because the system does not rely on individual agreement, it rests on expectation. And expectation, once established, becomes something that moves quietly through every part of life. Names are recorded, obligations are tracked, and those who are required to serve are drawn into the same paths that others have already taken, not all at once, not in overwhelming numbers, but steadily, continuously, so that the flow of labor does not break. And as this structure deepens, another layer is added. Those who cannot provide service in the expected way, those who have moved outside the boundaries of law, are redirected, not removed from the system, but placed within it in a different role. For them, the journey north is not part of a cycle that will return them home. It is something more fixed, more prolonged. Their presence becomes part of the work itself, held within it for longer periods, shaped by the same rhythm, but without the same expectation of release. And within the space of the wall, these differences begin to blur, because the work does not change based on who performs it. The earth is gathered in the same way, pressed in the same way, carried forward by the same repetition. And over time, the distinction between duty and punishment becomes less visible in the movement itself. It exists, but not in a way that can be easily seen from a distance, because what defines the experience is not the reason for being there, but the continuation of the work. And as more people are drawn into this structure, the system begins to stabilize, not in the sense of ease, but in its ability to sustain itself. Labor flows from one place to another. Time is converted into movement. Obligation becomes action, and the wall continues to rise. But within this stability, there is also something else, a quiet rigidity, because a system that depends on constant movement must maintain that movement, even as conditions become more difficult. It does not slow easily, it does not adjust quickly, it continues because it has been set into motion. And so, even as distance increases, even as the cost of sustaining the work becomes more apparent, the structure that supports it remains in place, extending further, reaching deeper into the lives of those who are part of it. And gradually, this reach becomes something that is felt not only at the edges of the empire, but within it. Because when time is given to the state, it is taken from somewhere else, from the field, from the home, from the quiet rhythms that once defined daily life. And as this continues, the balance begins to shift, not in a way that can be seen in a single moment, but through accumulation, through the quiet absence of those who have left, through the work that remains unfinished in the places they once occupied. And yet, the system does not pause to consider these changes, because its purpose is not to preserve what was, but to continue what has been set in motion, and so the movement persists, carried through obligation, sustained by structure, extended across the land in ways that reach far beyond the wall itself. And as this structure deepens, another realization begins to take form, not within the center stage, but at the edge, that what is being built here is not only a boundary of earth, but a boundary of effort, a line that marks how much can be given, and how far that giving can extend. And in the days that follow, that line will be tested, not by what lies beyond it, but by the limits of those who are asked to sustain it. As the system settles more firmly into place, and the flow of labor continues without interruption, another layer begins to emerge within it, not separate from the work, but woven into it. Quiet at first, difficult to distinguish from the rest, because here, movement, looks the same. The same earth is carried, the same soil is pressed. The same rhythm continues, regardless of how one arrives within it. And yet, beneath that sameness, there are differences. Some have come because their time was called. Others because they were sent. Not to serve for a season, but to remain. And over time, this difference begins to take on a shape of its own. It is not marked clearly. There are no boundaries drawn between one group and another, but it is felt. In the way certain bodies move. In the way some do not step away when the rhythm softens. In the way rest, when it comes, does not carry the same meaning. For those who are here under obligation alone, there is a sense, however distant, that the movement has a limit. That time, once given, may one day return. But for others, that sense does not exist. Their presence is not measured in cycles, not counted in seasons. It is held within the work itself, extended without a clear end. And within that extension, the rhythm begins to feel different. Not in its pattern, but in its weight. Because when movement continues without the expectation of release, it settles more deeply into the body. Each repetition carries forward, without the quiet reassurance that it will one day stop. And over time, that absence begins to shape the experience. Not through force, not through sudden hardship, but through duration. The quiet understanding that the work is not part of life, but has become its form. Among those who move within this condition, there are signs, subtle, unspoken, hands that do not loosen their grip, even when the tool is set aside, shoulders that remain slightly lifted, as if still carrying weight, movements that continue in smaller ways, even in stillness, because the body, once shaped by repetition, does not easily return to what it was before. And as this continues, the distinction between effort and identity begins to soften. A person is no longer only someone who works. They become part of the work itself, defined by movement, held within it. And around them, the system continues to operate as it always has. Food is carried, earth is shaped, the wall rises, unaffected in its direction, unchanged in its purpose, because the structure does not adjust for individual experience. It absorbs it. It continues regardless of how that continuation is felt. And within that continuation, those who cannot remain within the rhythm begin to fall away, not suddenly, not in a way that calls attention, but in the same quiet manner that defines everything here. A slowing that does not recover, a movement that no longer returns, a presence that fades from the line, leaving only the space where it once stood. And as this happens, the system does not pause. It does not mark the moment. It does not hold what has been lost, because its focus is forward, always forward, toward the next section, the next layer, the next extension of the line. And yet, even without being marked, these moments do not disappear entirely. They remain in the awareness of those who continue, felt rather than spoken. A quiet understanding that the work carries more than earth, more than distance. It carries consequence, not always visible, not always immediate, but present, in the way the body changes, in the way movement becomes heavier, in the way endurance is no longer simply a matter of strength. And as more people are drawn into this space, from different regions, from different circumstances, this understanding begins to spread, not as resistance, not as refusal, but as recognition, that the system they move within does not distinguish between those who arrive willingly and those who do not. because once within the rhythm, the movement is the same. And over time, that sameness begins to shape everything. The days, the body, the sense of time. Even the idea of return becomes something distant, difficult to hold with certainty. And within that distance, something begins to settle. Not fear, not in a sharp or immediate way, but a quiet heaviness, a presence that does not leave, even when the work pauses, because it is not tied to a single moment. It is carried forward through repetition, through duration, through the gradual narrowing of what the body can give. And as this continues, the wall rises, steady, unbroken, formed not only by the movement of many, but by the weight that remains within them. And in the days that follow, this weight will deepen, not through sudden change, but through the quiet accumulation of time, as the system continues to hold, and those within it continue to give, until the line between effort and endurance begins to disappear. As the weight of the system settles more deeply into the rhythm of each day, something else begins to change, not in the structure of the work, but in the time that holds it. At first, the movement of labor follows the light. It begins as the sky brightens and softens as the day fades. There is a natural boundary, quiet and familiar, shaped by the rising and setting of the sun. But over time, as the wall extends and the demand continues without pause, that boundary begins to loosen. Gradually, almost without announcement, the work begins to move beyond the day. At first, it is only an extension. A few movements carried forward into the dimming light. A section that must be completed before stopping. A moment where the rhythm does not fully release when the sun disappears. And then, those moments begin to repeat. Again and again, until they no longer feel like exceptions. They become part of the pattern. And with that change, the night begins to take on a different role. It is no longer only a time of rest. It becomes an extension of the work, not everywhere, not all at once, but enough that the rhythm no longer belongs to the day alone. Fires are lit, small, controlled, placed where they can offer just enough light to continue movement. Their glow does not reveal the full shape of the land. It creates pockets, isolated spaces where hands can still gather earth, where tools can still rise and fall, where the line can continue, even in darkness. And within those pockets, the rhythm persists. Slower, perhaps, more measured, but unbroken. The sound of earth being pressed does not disappear with the light. It softens, becomes more contained, but continues to repeat, carried by fewer movements, but with the same intention. For those who move within this extended rhythm, time begins to shift, not in a way that can be easily described, but in the way it is felt. The distinction between day and night begins to blur, because the body no longer fully leaves the work when the light fades. It continues in reduced motion, in dimmer space, in a rhythm that stretches beyond what once marked its limits. And as this continues, rest becomes something else. Shorter, less complete. Not a full release, but a pause within a longer cycle. The body lowers itself to the ground, but does not fully let go of the movement, because the rhythm remains, faint but present, carried in the muscles, in the breath, in the quiet expectation that it will begin again, soon. And when it does, there is no sense of beginning, only continuation. The tool is lifted, the soil is gathered. The movement resumes, as if it had never fully stopped. Around them, the fires burn steadily. Their light flickers across the rising sections of earth, casting shadows that shift and stretch across surfaces that are still taking form. The wall, seen in this light, appears different, less defined, more uncertain, but still present, still growing. And within that dim space, the body moves in a different way, more careful, more deliberate, because the ground is less visible, and each step must be placed with greater awareness. And yet, even with this change, the rhythm holds. Because it no longer depends on clarity, it depends on repetition. And repetition, once established, does not require full light to continue. Over time, this extension of work into the night begins to deepen the sense of duration. Days are no longer felt as separate units. They stretch into one another, connected by movement that does not fully pause. And within that stretch, fatigue settles differently, not as a sharp arrival at the end of effort, but as a constant presence carried from one period into the next. The body does not recover completely. It adjusts, finds smaller ways to continue, conserves where it can, releases where it must. And in that adjustment, endurance takes on a quieter form, not strong, not forceful, but persistent. A continuation that does not rely on renewal, but on the ability to remain within the rhythm, even as the body moves further from rest. And as more nights are drawn into the work, the sense of limit begins to fade. Not because it no longer exists, but because it is no longer clearly marked. There is no single point where effort ends, no boundary where the body is fully returned to itself. Only intervals, brief and incomplete, before the movement resumes. And within this extended cycle, the weight of the system deepens, because what is asked is no longer confined to a portion of the day. It stretches across time itself, and those within it are carried along, not by force, but by the continuity of what has already begun. And as this continue, as the fires burn into the dark, and the rhythm moves quietly through the night, another change begins to take form, not in the movement, not in the structure, but in the body's ability to hold what is being asked of it. Because when time no longer offers a clear place to rest, the limits that once guided effort begin to shift. And in the days that follow, those limits will begin to appear, not as boundaries that can be respected, but as thresholds that are quietly crossed, as the rhythm stretches across both day and night, and the boundaries that once shaped effort begin to fade. The body enters a different kind of experience, not new, but deeper, because what was once a cycle of work and rest has become something more continuous. And within that continuity, the body must find a way to remain. At first, it adapts. Quietly, without resistance, movements become smaller, more efficient, shaped by the need to conserve energy rather than spend it. Steps shorten. The lifting of tools becomes more controlled. Even the breath begins to settle into a pattern that avoids excess. And for a time, this is enough. The work continues. The rhythm holds. The wall rises. But adaptation does not remove the limit. It only moves it. And over time, that limit begins to return, not suddenly, not in a way that can be clearly marked, but in the accumulation of small changes, each one adding to the next. A movement that once required little thought now demands attention. A step that once felt certain becomes less stable. A breath that once returned easily now lingers, slightly out of reach. And yet, the rhythm continues. Because the system does not change with these shifts, it remains steady, carried forward by those who can still move within it. And for those who begin to feel the limit more closely, the experience becomes something else. Not only effort, but strain. A quiet pressure within the body, not tied to a single action, but present across all of them. It settles into the muscles, into the joints, into the places where movement is repeated most often. And over time, it becomes familiar, not in a way that brings comfort, but in a way that no longer surprises, because it does not leave. It moves with the body, remains, even when the work pauses, carried forward into the next cycle. And within that persistence, the sense of recovery begins to change. Rest no longer restores what has been used. It only allows the body to continue. A brief stillness before the movement returns. And as this pattern deepens, the distance between what the body can give and what is asked of it begins to narrow. At first, this narrowing is subtle. The work feels heavier, but still possible. The rhythm requires more attention, but does not break, but gradually, the space becomes smaller. The margin that once allowed for adjustment begins to disappear, and within that space, moments begin to appear, small at first. A hesitation before lifting, a pause that lingers too long, a movement that does not complete in the same way it once did. And then, the body continues, because it must, because the rhythm continues around it, unchanged, and to remain within it, the movement must resume. But each of these moments leaves something behind, not visible, not measurable, but present. A trace of what the body has given and not fully regained. And as those traces gather, they begin to shape the way the body moves, less freely, less fully, more carefully, more narrowly, as if each motion must now pass through something that resists it. Around them, others move in similar ways, not identical, but aligned in their effort, because the limit is not unique to one person. It exists within all who remain in the work, felt differently, reached at different times, but present in each body that carries the rhythm forward. And within that shared experience, there is no need for words, no explanation, only recognition, a quiet understanding, carried in the way movements slow, in the way effort becomes heavier, in the way the rhythm holds, even as the body begins to fall behind it. And when that happens, when the limit is reached more fully, the moment is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It arrives quietly, a movement that cannot be completed, a step that does not follow, a breath that does not return in time, and in that moment, the rhythm moves on. It does not stop. It does not turn back. It continues, carried by others, extending forward along the line. For those who reach that point, there is a stillness, not chosen, not planned, but present. And within that stillness, the body reveals what it can no longer hold, the strain that has accumulated, the energy that has been spent without full return, the limit, no longer distant but immediate. And yet, even as this occurs, the work does not change. Because it is not shaped by the limits of any one body, it is sustained by the continuation of many. And so, the line extends, the earth rises, the rhythm returns, steady, unbroken, carried forward by those who remain within it. And gradually, those moments of stillness, those quiet points where the body can no longer continue, begin to form a pattern of their own, not visible from afar, not recorded in any formal way, but present within the experience of the work. And as this pattern deepens, another understanding begins to take shape, not through instruction, not through command, but through repetition. That what is being asked here is not only effort, not only endurance, but something that reaches further, something that continues even when the body begins to resist. And as the wall rises, layer by layer, across distance that does not shorten, that demand will continue to grow, quietly, steadily, until the limits that once guided the body are no longer enough to contain what is required. And in the days that follow, those limits will be crossed, not in a single moment, but in the slow, continuous way that defines everything here. As the body moves closer to its limits, and the rhythm continues without pause, something else begins to take on greater importance. Not the strength of the body alone, but the means by which that strength is extended. Because the work, for all its repetition, does not rely on muscle alone. It depends on tools, simple at first glance, unremarkable, and yet essential. A wooden frame set into the ground to hold the shape of rising earth. A weighted tool lifted and brought down again and again to press the soil into firmness. A carrying pole balanced across the shoulders, holding equal weight at each end, allowing the body to move more steadily across uneven ground. None of these objects are complex. They do not change the nature of the work, but they allow it to continue. And over time, they begin to shape the way the body moves. The hand learns where to grip. The shoulder learns how to balance. The arm learns the exact height required to lift and the precise force needed to bring the weight down again. And as this learning settles into the body, the movement becomes more consistent, more controlled, less dependent on sudden effort, and more on repetition that can be sustained. In places where the land rises sharply, other tools appear, ropes stretched across narrow spaces, allowing materials to be pulled rather than carried. Simple pulleys, turning weight into motion, reducing the strain just enough to make the impossible possible. And along these lines, people move in coordination, not through spoken command, but through shared timing. One pulls, another releases. The motion continues, not in isolation, but as part of something that connects each person to the next. And in that connection, the work extends beyond the individual, because what one body cannot carry alone can be moved through many. And so, the line grows, not only through strength, but through the quiet cooperation shaped by necessity. In flatter regions, where distance stretches without interruption, other forms begin to appear. Wheels set beneath simple platforms, allowing loads to move across the ground with less resistance. They do not remove the effort, they change it. The body no longer lifts in the same way. It pushes, guides. It maintains balance as the weight rolls forward. And over time, this movement becomes its own rhythm, a steady forward pressure, sustained over distance, shaped by the ground beneath it. And as these tools become part of the work, they begin to form a system of their own, not separate from the wall, but woven into its creation. Each object, each method, extending the reach of the body just enough to continue the movement across greater distance. And yet, even as the work becomes more organized, more structured, it does not become easier, because what is gained in efficiency is often met with greater demand, more distance to cover, more material to move, more ground to shape, And so, the tools do not reduce the effort. They allow it to continue at scale. For those within this system, the presence of tools becomes so constant that it begins to feel natural. The hand does not think before reaching. The body does not hesitate before lifting. The movement has been repeated too many times, shaped too deeply, to require conscious decision. And within that repetition, the distinction between the body and the tool begins to soften. The weight that is lifted is not separate from the arm that lifts it. The impact of the tool against the earth is not separate from the motion that creates it. They move together, as one continuous action. And in that continuity, the work takes on a different form. Not only something that is done, but something that is carried through motion, through contact, through the repeated exchange between body and earth. Around them, the sound continues. The steady rhythm of impact, now joined by the quieter movements of wheels, of ropes under tension, of wood shifting against weight. Each sound blends into the next, forming a pattern that extends across the entire space. Not loud, not overwhelming, but constant. And because it is constant, it becomes something that no longer requires attention. It simply remains. A presence that holds the work together, even as individual movements begin to falter. And as the system deepens, as tools extend the body, and the body adapts to the tools, another realization begins to form, not spoken, not clearly defined, but felt. That even with all of this, even with the coordination, the extension, the repetition, the work does not end. Because each improvement and each adjustment does not close the distance. It allows the distance to grow. The wall extends further, the need expands, and the system must follow. And so, the tools continue to move, the bodies continue to adapt, the rhythm continues, carried forward through every motion, through every contact, through every repetition that does not yet reveal its end. And in the days that follow, this extension, this quiet expansion of effort through structure, will reach into places where even the tools cannot fully relieve the weight, where the body, even supported, even extended, must still carry what remains. And as that moment approaches, the work will begin to reveal something else. Not in the movement, but in the space where movement becomes most difficult to sustain. As the tools extend the reach of the body, and the rhythm carries the work forward across greater distance, there are places where that movement begins to change. Not everywhere, not all at once. But in certain stretches of land, the work does not continue in the same way. At first, it is only a difference in feeling. The ground beneath the feet shifts. What was once firm becomes loose. What once held its shape begins to give way under pressure. The soil does not settle as easily. It resists, not by force, but by instability. And in those places, the rhythm begins to slow. Not because the work is stopped, but because it cannot continue at the same pace. Each movement requires adjustment. The earth must be gathered more carefully, pressed more deliberately. Layers that once held with little effort must now be reinforced, shaped again, held in place longer before the next can be added. And as this happens, the body must respond, not with more strength, but with more attention, because the land does not accept the same motion it once did. It shifts beneath it, changes the way weight is carried, alters the way pressure must be applied. And within that adjustment, the rhythm becomes less fluid, more measured, more aware. each step placed with greater care, each movement completed with greater focus, and yet, even with this change, the work does not stop, because stopping is not part of what has been set into motion. It continues, shaped now not only by repetition, but by resistance. In regions where the land rises, the effort changes again. The ground tilts. The distance between one step and the next becomes uneven. Carrying weight no longer follows a steady path. It moves upward against the natural pull of the body, and with that change, the strain deepens. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but steadily. With each step taken against the slope, the breath shortens, the pace slows, and the weight, once carried across level ground, begins to press more heavily into the body. In these places, the tools can only do so much. Ropes are stretched. Pulley systems are arranged, but the terrain does not fully yield. There are sections where the body must still carry what cannot be moved otherwise. Stone, gathered from nearby outcrops, heavier than earth, less forgiving, more difficult to shape. It is lifted, positioned, set into place with care, and then held by the effort required to keep it from falling back. And as this continues, the wall begins to change in form, no longer only packed earth, but a combination of what the land provides. Stone in one place, soil in another, each section shaped by what is available and what can be sustained. And in this variation, the work becomes less uniform, not in its purpose, but in its execution, because the land does not offer the same conditions everywhere, and so the wall must follow. It bends, rises, descends, adapts to contours that cannot be removed. And in doing so, it reveals something more clearly, that it is not separate from the land. It is drawn from it, formed by it, limited by it, and carried across it, through the effort of those who remain within the work. For those who move through these more difficult sections, the experience deepens, not only in effort, but in awareness. Because here, the rhythm is no longer enough. It must be guided, each motion considered, even within repetition, and that consideration adds weight of its own, not physical, but constant. A quiet focus that does not release. And over time, this focus becomes another form of strain, less visible, but no less present. And as the work continues through these resistant places, progress becomes harder to measure. The wall still rises, but more slowly, more unevenly, and the distance ahead remains unchanged. Because while the land alters the pace, it does not shorten the path. And so, the effort must continue. Adjusted, redirected, sustained in ways that respond to what the ground allows. And around these sections, others continue to work where the land is more yielding. Their rhythm remains steady, their movement less interrupted, and the difference between these spaces becomes clear, not in value, but in experience. Some sections carry the weight of repetition, others carry the weight of resistance, and both extend the line together. And as this continues, as the wall stretches across land that does not always accept it, another understanding begins to take shape, that even with adaptation, even with tools, even with careful movement, there are limits that cannot be fully overcome, only approached and worked through. And in the days that follow, those limits will become more present, not only in the land, but in the way the work continues to ask for more than the body can easily give. As the wall continues to take shape, rising slowly across the land that both supports and resists it, something else begins to emerge. Not within the base of the wall, but along its upper edge. At first, it is not intentional, only the result of repeated movement. The top of the wall, once uneven, begins to settle under the pressure of feet that pass across it. Soil is pressed, not by tools alone, but by the steady crossing of those who move from one section to another. And over time, that surface begins to change. It becomes flatter, more defined. A narrow path shaped by use rather than design. And as this path becomes clearer, it begins to take on a different purpose. Not only a place to build, but a place to move. Those who work along the wall begin to use it, not as a destination, but as a route. A way to cross ground that is otherwise uneven, interrupted, or difficult to navigate. From this height, the movement changes. The land below stretches outward in wider patterns. The sections of wall that once felt isolated begin to connect, at least in the experience of those who walk along them. And gradually, this movement becomes more regular, not constant, but repeated often enough that the path begins to hold. Steps fall in familiar places. Turns follow the natural curve of the structure, and the wall, once only a boundary, begins to act as a line of passage. For those who move along it, the experience is different from the work below. The body still carries weight, still follows the rhythm of effort, but the perspective changes. From above, the land reveals more of itself. The variation of ground, the distance between sections, the places where the wall rises strongly, and the places where it softens into the terrain. And in this view, something becomes clearer. The wall is not one continuous form. Not yet. It is a series of efforts, connected by intention, moving towards something larger. The path along its top reflects that. In some places it is steady, wide enough for several to move side by side. In others, it narrows, requiring careful steps, balance maintained with greater attention. And still, it continues, because the need to move across the work becomes as important as the work itself. Materials must be delivered from one section to another. Messages must travel, carried from one group to the next. And gradually, the wall begins to support this movement, not by design alone, but by the way it is used. And as this use deepens, another layer begins to form, not in the earth, but in the system, because a path that allows movement also allows observation. Those who stand upon the wall can see further, not in detail, but in distance. The open land to the north, the shifting patterns that do not settle, the faint traces of movement that appear and then disappear. And for the first time, the wall begins to serve not only as a structure, but as a place from which the edge can be watched. Not constantly, not with precision, but enough to create a different kind of awareness, a presence held along the boundary rather than scattered across it. And within that presence, the meaning of the wall begins to expand. It is no longer only something that stands. It becomes something that is occupied, lived upon in small ways by those who remain along its length, resting briefly on its surface, moving across it, pausing to look outward, even if only for a moment. And in those moments, the separation between the two worlds becomes more visible. Below, the land that has been shaped, measured, defined. Beyond, the land that continues to move without fixed boundary, and between them, this rising line, not complete, not unbroken, but present. And as more sections connect and more people move along its surface, the wall begins to feel less like a collection of fragments and more like something that carries direction. A line that does not simply exist in place, but extends, guiding movement along its length. And with that direction comes something else, a need to maintain it, because a path that is used must be kept. The surface must remain firm, the edges must hold, and so the work extends upward, not only building the wall, but shaping the space above it, flattening, reinforcing, ensuring that the line can continue to support what now moves across it. And as this continues, the wall begins to rise not only in height, but in function. Layer by layer, it becomes something more than a boundary. It becomes a route, a place of passage and of presence. And in the days that follow, this presence will begin to take on greater meaning, not only for those who build, but for those who remain, watching along the edge. As the line grows longer and the space it defines becomes clearer, the wall will begin to hold something else. Not only earth, not only movement, but attention, directed outward, across the distance that still remains beyond it. As the wall begins to carry movement along its upper path, and the surface is shaped not only by labor, but by use, another layer settles quietly into place, not built from earth, not carried by tools, but held in attention. Because once the wall can be walked, it can also be watched from. At first, this watching is incidental, a pause between movements, a moment when the body slows and the eyes lift, not with intention, but with the simple need to rest from repetition. The land beyond is still distant, still open, still difficult to define, but from the height of the wall, it is seen differently, not in detail, but in relation. The line beneath the feet feels more present, the space beyond it more distinct, and over time, these moments begin to gather. They become less accidental, more expected, because where there is a boundary, there's also the need to observe it, not constantly, not with urgency, but with a quiet consistency that mirrors the rhythm of the work itself. And so, in certain sections, those who remain along the wall begin to take on a different role. They still move, still carry, still shape the earth when needed. But between those movements, they watch, looking outward across the land that does not settle, the plains that shift in color with the passing light, the distant forms that appear and then dissolve back into distance. There is no clear pattern, no fixed presence that can be held in sight. Only moments, brief, uncertain, difficult to follow. And yet, these moments are enough, because they sustain the idea that gave rise to the wall in the first place, that beyond the line there is movement, and that movement does not belong to the same rhythm, and so the act of watching becomes part of the system, not separate from the work, but woven into it, a continuation of the same intention, expressed in a different form, where hands shape the boundary, eyes begin to trace it, following its length, observing where it holds and where it fades into the land. And gradually, this awareness begins to extend, not only across space, but across time. Because watching is not only about what is seen in a single moment, it is about what returns, what repeats, what shifts, in ways that are difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. And within this slow accumulation, patterns begin to form. Not clear, not defined, but present. A sense that certain movements occur more often in certain places. That some stretches of land remain quieter, while others hold a different kind of activity. And though these patterns are not fixed, they are remembered, carried forward from one moment to the next, shaping the way attention is held along the wall. For those who stand within this role, the experience is different from the labor below. The body still carries weight, still moves within the rhythm, but the mind is drawn outward, toward distance, toward uncertainty, toward a space that cannot be shaped in the same way as Earth. And within that outward focus, time takes on another form. Moments stretch, not through repetition, but through waiting. Waiting for something to appear, or not to appear. Waiting for change, or for stillness to continue. And in that waiting, a different kind of endurance begins to form, less physical, but no less demanding, because it requires presence without movement, attention without clear result. And as this continues, the wall begins to hold more than structure. It becomes a place where different forms of effort exist together. The shaping of earth, the carrying of weight, the watching of distance, each one distinct but connected. Because all are directed toward the same edge, and as more sections of the wall begin to connect, this presence grows, not in intensity, but in reach, extending further across the land, held in different ways, by different bodies, but forming something that is slowly becoming continuous. And within that continuity, the meaning of the wall deepens. It is no longer only a response, it becomes a condition, a constant along the boundary of the empire. And as this condition settles, another question begins to form. Not about whether the wall can be built, but about what it will become. Because a line that is watched, that is moved across, that is sustained through constant effort, does not remain unchanged. It evolves, not quickly, not in ways that are immediately visible, but through the quiet accumulation of use, of attention, of time. And in the days that follow, that evolution will begin to take on clearer form, not only in the wall itself, but in the way it begins to shape everything around it. The land, the people, the system, all drawn into its presence, all gradually adjusted to the fact that the boundary is no longer something imagined, but something that continues, without pause, along the edge of the world they know. As the wall continues to extend, and the system that sustains it settles into a steady, unbroken rhythm, something else begins to shift, not in the land, not in the structure, but in time itself. At first, time is still felt in the body, in the rise and fall of effort, in the repetition of movement, in the slow passing of days that can be measured, even if only faintly. But over time, as the rhythm deepens and the boundaries between day and night begin to soften, time becomes less distinct, less separate. It no longer arrives in clear segments. Instead, it stretches, one day moving into the next, without a sharp edge between them. And within that stretch, the sense of progression begins to change, because the work does not follow time. It continues regardless of it. The wall rises, slowly, steadily, not marking days, not marking years, only extending through whatever time is given to it. And as this continues, a quiet contrast begins to form. The body changes, it adapts, then weakens, then adapts again, It carries the signs of time clearly, in movement, in strain, in the quiet limits that return again and again. But the wall does not change in the same way. It grows, but it does not tire. It extends, but it does not feel the passage of time within itself. Each layer, once pressed into place, remains, unaffected by the repetition that created it, unaffected by the bodies that shaped it. And gradually, this difference becomes more noticeable, not in a single moment, but in the quiet accumulation of awareness. Those who move within the work begin to sense it, not as a thought, but as a feeling, difficult to name, but present. That the effort they give belongs to time, but what they build does not. And as I reflect on this, there is something quiet in that difference, something that does not demand attention, but remains beneath the surface of the work, because the wall, once formed, holds its shape, while the body must continue to change. And within that contrast, the meaning of the work begins to shift just slightly, not away from its purpose, but deeper into what it represents. Because it is no longer only a boundary, it becomes a place where time is experienced differently, where movement continues, but does not lead to completion, where effort accumulates, but does not return in the same form. And within that space, the question of time becomes less about duration and more about presence. How long something lasts and how long something can continue, and these are not always the same. The wall may last, but the body must continue in order for it to rise. And as this understanding settles, another layer begins to form, quiet, almost imperceptible, but present within the rhythm. A sense that what is being built is not only shaped by time, but also stands apart from it. Because once a section is complete, it remains. It does not return to those who built it. It does not carry their movement forward. It simply exists in place. And over time, more sections join it, extending the line, layer by layer, until the distance behind becomes as long as the distance ahead. And for those within the work, this creates a different kind of experience, because the beginning becomes distant, difficult to remember clearly, and the end remains unseen. And so, the present moment becomes the only place where the work exists, not as a choice, but as a condition. And within that condition, time continues to move, quietly, unnoticed, carried forward not by markers, but by the slow change in the body and the steady growth of the wall. And yet, even as time moves, the system does not shift. It holds steady, unchanging in its direction, because it is not designed to respond to time, but to continue through it. And in that continuation, something becomes clear, not immediately, not fully, but enough to be felt, that the wall, for all its movement, is not truly moving. It remains, even as everything around it changes, and those who build it are part of that change, carried forward by time, shaped by it, and gradually moved beyond it, while the wall stays. And as this quiet contrast deepens, the work continues. The rhythm holds, the line extends, and time moves on, without pause, without interruption, touching everything within the system, except the form that is left behind. And in the days that follow, this difference will begin to settle more deeply into the experience of the work, not as something that is spoken, but as something that is felt, in the quiet space between what continues and what remains. As time continues to move quietly through the work, and the wall extends beyond what any single person can fully see, the difference between what changes and what remains becomes more present, not in a sudden way, not as a realization that arrives all at once, but gradually, through the slow accumulation of moments that begin to feel less distinct from one another. The rhythm continues, the movement holds, the wall rises, and yet, within that continuation, something begins to soften, not in the structure, not in the system, but in the way the work is experienced, because over time, the body adjusts not only to effort, but to repetition itself. Days no longer feel separate, they blend, one movement leading into the next, without a clear sense of beginning or end. And within that blending, memory begins to change, not lost, but less defined. The place where one began, the moment of arrival, the path that led here, all remain, but at a distance, less immediate, less sharp, because the present has taken on a different weight. It holds more space, more attention, more of what can be felt. And as I reflect on this, there is something quiet in the way time reshapes what is remembered, not by removing it, but by placing it further away, so that what remains closest is not the past, but the repetition that continues now, and within that repetition, the sense of self begins to shift, not disappearing, but becoming less tied to what came before. Because the work does not ask who a person was, it asks only what can be done, again, and again, and again. And over time, that question becomes the one that matters most. The body responds. The movement continues, and everything else slowly moves outward. Not gone, but no longer at the center. Around them, the wall continues to hold its form. Sections that were once new now stand as part of something older. They do not change in the same way as the body. They do not carry the passing of days within them. They remain. And as more layers are added, they extend that presence further across the land. And in this contrast, something becomes clearer. That what is built does not remember in the same way as the one who builds it. It does not hold the moments of effort. It does not carry the weight of repetition. It simply exists as the result of those things. And as this understanding settles, it begins to shape the way the work is felt, not as something that will be completed, but as something that continue beyond the moment in which it is experienced. And within that continuation, there is a quiet stillness, not the stillness of rest, but the stillness of something that does not need to change. The wall does not hurry. It does not pause. It simply extends and then remains. And in that sense, it begins to feel less like an action and more like a presence, something that occupies space without requiring constant attention to exist. And for those within the work, this creates a subtle shift, because the effort they give does not stay with them. It becomes part of something that does not return. And over time, this can be felt, not as loss, but as distance, a separation between what is done and what remains afterward. And as that distance grows, the work takes on a quieter meaning, less defined by outcome and more by continuation, because the result is no longer immediate. It is placed into something larger, something that extends beyond the moment, beyond the individual, beyond even the span of time that can be easily held. And as I consider this, there is something calm in that idea. Not heavy, not overwhelming, but steady. That what is done does not disappear. It simply becomes part of something that continues in its own way. And within that thought, the rhythm feels different. Not easier, not lighter, but more settled, because it no longer depends on reaching an end. It continue because continuation itself has become the form of the work. And so, the movement remains, the wall extends, the days pass without clear edges. And the difference between what changes and what stays becomes something that is no longer questioned, only experienced. And in the days that follow, this quiet understanding will deepen, not through new effort, but through the gradual fading of what once felt immediate, as the work continues and the presence of the wall remains unchanged. As the work continue and the quiet understanding of what remains begins to settle more deeply, another change begins to take shape, not in the wall, not in the system, but in the sense of the individual within it. At first, this sense remains clear. Each person carries a memory of where they came from, a feeling of movement from one place to another, a quiet awareness that this work exists within a larger life. But over time, as the rhythm continues without clear beginning or end, that awareness begins to shift. Not suddenly, not in a way that can be easily marked, but gradually, through repetition, through duration, through the steady narrowing of what must be held in each moment. Because the work does not ask for memory. It does not require reflection. It does not pause for the past to be considered. It asks only for continuation. And so, the body responds. Movement follows movement. Breath follows effort. The present moment becomes the only place where action exists. And within that focus, everything else begins to move outward, not lost, but less immediate, less necessary. The name of a place, the shape of a home, the sound of voices that once filled the space of daily life all remain somewhere beyond the rhythm. But they are no longer held in the same way, because holding them requires space, and space within the work becomes limited. And as I reflect on this, there is something quiet in the way the self begins to change, not disappearing, but softening, becoming less defined by what it once was, and more by what it continues to do. And within that change, a different kind of presence begins to form, not centered on identity, but on movement. A person becomes part of the rhythm, carried within it, sustained by it, and gradually shaped by its repetition. And around them, the system continues, unchanged, unaffected by this quiet shift, because it is not designed to respond to the individual. It exists to continue, to extend the wall, to maintain the flow of labor, of supply, of attention across the land. And within that continuation, the role of the individual becomes less distinct, not removed, but absorbed. Each movement contributes, each effort adds, but no single action defines the whole. And over time, this becomes something that is no longer questioned. It is simply how the work exists. Many bodies, many movements, all carried forward within the same direction, toward the same extension of the line. And within that collective motion, the sense of separation between one person and another begins to soften as well. Differences remain, in origin, in path, in reason for being here. But within the rhythm, those differences hold less weight, because the movement is shared, the effort is shared, the continuation is shared, and gradually, this shared experience becomes the most immediate reality, more present than memory, more constant than identity, and in that presence, the self becomes quieter, not gone, not erased, but less central, less defined by what it once held, and more shaped by what it now does. And as this continues, the wall rises, unchanged in its form, extended by countless movements, each one part of something larger, and the system holds, steady, persistent, moving forward without pause, without reflection, without the need to consider the individual within it. And as I consider this, there is something still in that contrast. The quiet of the self becoming softer, and the persistence of the system remaining unchanged. And between them, the work continues, not driven by identity, but by repetition, not held by memory, but by movement. And in the days that follow, this quieting will deepen, not through force, not through loss, but through the simple continuation of what has already begun, as the line extends, and the presence of the system becomes the space in which everything now exists. As the self grows quieter within the rhythm, and the wall continues to extend without pause, another understanding begins to settle, not as a thought that arrives suddenly, but as a condition that becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. Because while the body changes, and memory softens, and the sense of individual presence becomes less defined, the system does not follow the same path. It holds, steady, unmoved by the shifts that pass through those within it. At first, this difference is subtle, almost unnoticeable, because everything appears to be part of the same movement. The wall rises, the labor continues, the supply lines extend, the watching remains. And within all of this, the system feels continuous. But over time, as the body adjusts and readjusts and begins to reach its limits, as the self becomes quieter, less centered, more absorbed into the rhythm, the contrast begins to emerge. Because the system does not tire, it does not slow, it does not require rest, it continues as long as it is sustained, and what sustains it is not a single body, not a single moment, but the ongoing flow of many. And so, even as individuals move through cycles of effort and exhaustion, even as some fall out of the rhythm, even as others arrive to take their place, the system remains, not unchanged in detail, but unchanged in direction. It continues to ask, continues to draw, continues to extend, and within that continuation, the wall grows, layer by layer, across time that does not need to be marked. And as I reflect on this, there is something quiet in the way the system outlasts the individual, not through intention, not through force alone, but through structure, through the way it is built to continue, regardless of who carries it forward. And within that structure, the meaning of the work shifts again, not away from what it is, but deeper into what it represents, because it is no longer only a boundary built across land. It becomes a pattern, a way in which effort is gathered, directed, and sustained beyond the limits of any one life. And within that pattern, there is a kind of stillness, not in the sense of stopping, but in the sense of persistence, a continuation that does not depend on change, even as everything within it changes. And for those who remain inside this movement, this creates a different kind of experience, because the work is no longer something that moves toward completion. It becomes something that simply continues. And within that continuation, the idea of an end becomes distant, not impossible, but difficult to hold in a clear way, because there is always another section, another extension, another movement that follows the one before it. And so, the present becomes the only place where the work exists, not because the past is gone, but because it no longer shapes the movement in the same way, and not because the future is unknown, but because it does not yet interrupt the rhythm. And within this narrowing of time, the system finds its strength. It holds everything within the present moment, carries it forward, and does not need to look beyond it to continue. And so, the wall rises, the system holds, the rhythm continues, and everything else shifts, quietly, gradually, without breaking the movement that has already been set in place. And as this continues, another realization begins to form, not fully defined, not yet complete, but present, that the wall, for all its length, for all its persistence, is not separate from the system that sustains it. It is an expression of it, a form made visible. And in the days that follow, that connection will become clearer, not through explanation, but through the quiet way in which the system continues to hold, even as everything within it continues to change. As the system continues to hold, and the wall extends across distances that no single life can fully contain, the connection between what is built and what is given becomes more visible. Not in a single moment, not in a way that draws attention, but gradually, through the quiet accumulation of everything that has been placed into it. The wall stands, layer upon layer, shaped by repetition, held by effort that no longer exists in the form that created it. And as it stands, it carries something that is not immediately seen. Not only the earth, not only the structure, but the cost. Not counted in one place, not measured in one way, but present across time, across distance, across the many movements that have led to this point. For those within the work, this cost is not always something that can be clearly named. It is not a single event, not a single moment of loss. It is something that gathers, quietly, through the days that blend into one another, through the repetition that does not fully release, through the gradual shift of what the body can give. And over time, this gathering becomes something that is felt, even if it is not spoken. In the way movement changes, in the way effort settles more deeply into the body, in the way the rhythm continues, even as the strength that carries it begins to narrow. And as I reflect on this, there is something still in the way cost does not always appear where it is expected. It is not held only in the moment of effort. It is carried forward into what remains. Because the wall, once formed, does not show the movement that created it. It does not reveal the repetition. It does not hold the passing of time in a way that can be easily seen. It simply stands. And in that standing, the cost becomes something that is no longer part of the present moment, but part of what has already been given. And as more sections join and the line extends further, this quiet transfer continues. Effort becomes form. Time becomes distance. The body gives, and the wall remains. And within that exchange, something begins to settle, not as a question, not as a resistance, but as an understanding that what is built here is not only a boundary across land, it is a record, without words, of what has been placed into it, not in a way that can be read, but in a way that can be felt, through the presence of something that continues, long after the movement that created it has passed. And as the wall holds its place, the system continues, drawing from one place, extending into another, maintaining the flow that allows the line to remain. But within that continuation, the cost does not disappear, it spreads, not only along the wall, but into the lives that support it, into the places where people have left, into the fields that wait longer than before, into the quiet spaces where something once moved and no longer does. And yet, the system does not pause, because it is not shaped to consider what has already been given. It is shaped to continue. And so, the wall remains. The rhythm continues, the present holds, and everything that has been placed into this structure becomes part of something that does not return. And in the days that follow, this understanding will deepen, not through change, but through stillness. As the wall reaches a point where its presence is no longer only something that is being built, but something that already exists. And in that existence, the need to continue will begin to shift, not away from the work, but toward something quieter, something that does not require the same movement, but still holds the same meaning. And as that shift begins, the wall will remain, carrying with it everything that has been given and everything that has quietly become part of what cannot be taken back. As the wall continues to hold its place, and the system that built it settles into a steady stillness, something begins to change. Not in the structure, not in the land, but in the movement that once surrounded it. Because over time, the rhythm that carried the work forward begins to soften. Not suddenly, not in a way that can be clearly marked, but gradually, as if the motion itself is learning to rest. The tools are lifted less often. The sound of earth being pressed, once constant, becomes more distant. Not gone, but quieter, further apart. And within that quieting, space begins to appear. Small at first, moments where nothing moves, where the line stands, without being shaped, without being extended. And as these moments gather, they begin to form something new, a different kind of presence, not defined by action, but by what remains when action slows. The wall stands, unchanged in its form, carrying the weight of everything that has been placed into it. And yet, the movement that once defined it is no longer as immediate. It recedes, step by step, breath by breath, into something that no longer fills every moment. And as I reflect on this, there is something calm in the way effort gives way to stillness, not as an ending, but as a transition. Because what has been set in motion does not disappear, it settles, finds a place within the shape that has already been formed, and remains there, without needing to continue in the same way. Around the wall, the land continues as it always has. The wind moves across its surface. Light shifts from day into night and back again. Shadows pass along its length without altering what it is. And in this quiet continuity, the wall begins to feel less like something that is being built and more like something that simply exists. A presence, held in place, unaffected by the slowing of the movement that created it. And for those who remain nearby, the experience begins to change as well. The body, once shaped by constant repetition, begins to release that pattern, not all at once, not completely, but slowly, as the need to continue lessens. Muscles that once held tension begin to soften. Breath, once measured by effort, returns to a quieter rhythm. Movement, once guided by necessity, becomes less defined. And within that shift, a different kind of awareness begins to form, not focused on what must be done, but on what is already there, the wall, the land, the space between them. And in that awareness, there is no urgency, no demand to extend or to complete, only the presence of something that has already taken its shape. And as this stillness deepens, time begins to feel different once more. Not stretched, not compressed, but open, without the constant movement to mark its passing. Moments are no longer carried forward by repetition. They rest, settle into themselves, without needing to lead to the next. And in that settling, the sense of distance changes, not in the land, but in perception. The line that once extended endlessly now feels complete in each part that is seen, because it no longer depends on continuation to define it. It exists fully in what remains. And as I consider this, there's something quiet in the way the wall no longer asks for anything. It does not require effort. It does not call for movement. It simply holds. And in that holding, everything that has been given to it remains, not as memory, not as motion, but as form. And around that form, the world continues, unchanged in its larger rhythm. Wind, light, time, all moving, all passing, without altering what has already been set into place. And within that continuity, the need to act fades, not completely, but enough that stillness begins to feel natural, expected, even welcome. And so, the wall remains, the land remains, the quiet deepens, and everything that once moved to shape this line begins to settle into what it has become. Not ending, not disappearing, but resting within the form that continues, without effort, without motion, without the need to become anything more. And in the space that follows, there is only this, a line across the land, a presence held in place, and a stillness that does not ask to be broken. As the stillness settles more deeply across the land, and the wall remains unchanged beneath the passing of light and shadow, the movement that once shaped it becomes harder to find, not because it has vanished completely, but because it no longer defines what is present. The rhythm that carried the work forward, the sound that filled the air, the steady motion of bodies moving in repetition, all of it begins to recede, gently, without resistance, as if it is returning to a place where it no longer needs to remain. And in that return, the wall stands alone, not separate from what created it, but no longer surrounded by it. The earth holds its shape. The line stretches across distance that no longer needs to be measured, and the presence of the wall becomes something quiet, something that does not draw attention, but remains without effort. And as I reflect on this, there's something calm in the way movement gives way to stillness, not as a loss, but as a completion of a kind that does not require an ending, because what has been built does not need to continue in order to exist. It simply remains, and within that remaining, everything that once moved toward it settles. The body, once shaped by repetition, no longer follows the same rhythm. The hands, once guided by motion, now rest without needing to return. The breath, once measured by effort, becomes soft and even without demand. And within that quiet shift, there is no urgency to begin again, no need to extend or to complete, only the presence of what is already there, the wall, the land, the open space beyond, all existing together, without conflict, without movement that seeks to change them. And as the light moves across the surface of the earth, and the wind passes without interruption, the wall remains, not resisting, not responding, simply present. And in that presence, Time moves in its own way, not marked by action, not measured by effort, but flowing, gently, across what no longer changes. And for those who have moved within the work, this moment holds something different. Not defined by what was done, not shaped by what remains to be done, but by the quiet awareness of what is. A line across the land, a structure that holds its place, a stillness that does not need to be filled, and within that awareness there's nothing to carry, nothing to sustain, nothing to continue, only a soft recognition that the movement has passed, and what remains is enough. And as this understanding settles, even the sense of distance begins to soften. The line no longer stretches endlessly. It rests within the space that can be seen and felt without needing to extend further, because it does not ask to be followed, does not require completion, it simply holds. And within that holding there is quiet, a deep, steady quiet that does not change, and as everything else continues beyond it, the wall remains, unmoved, unbroken, and complete, in the way that only something without movement can be. And so, the final motion fades, the rhythm releases, the sound disappears into distance, and what is left is stillness, held across the land, without effort, without time, without the need to become anything more. And in that stillness, the story gently comes to rest, as the stillness settles fully across the land, and the wall remains as a quiet presence, no longer shaped by movement. There is space now to notice something that was always there, but difficult to feel while the work continued. Not in the structure itself, not in the distance it covers, but in what it reveals when nothing more is being asked. Because when effort fades and repetition no longer fills each moment, what remains is not only the wall, it is the meaning that begins to appear quietly within it. And as I reflect on this, there is something gentle in the way the wall teaches without speaking, not through instruction, not through force, but through presence. Because it stands as something that required immense effort, and yet asks for nothing now. It does not call for continuation. It does not demand attention. It simply exists, holding within it everything that has been given. And in that stillness, there is a lesson, not one that must be followed, but one that can be felt, that what we build, whether it is large or small, whether it is seen or not, often remains in ways we do not return to witness. The effort passes, the moment moves on, but the result, in its own quiet way, stays. And there is something calm in that. Not because everything endures forever, but because not everything needs to be held in order to have meaning. And as I consider the lives that once moved along this line, the countless moments of effort, of repetition, of quiet endurance, there is something else that becomes clear. That much of what shapes the world is not created in moments of intensity, but in repetition, in the steady continuation of small movements carried forward over time. And in that idea, there's a kind of reassurance, because it suggests that meaning is not always found in what is large, but in what continues, even when it is not noticed, even when it does not feel significant in the moment. And as the wall remains, unchanged, beneath the passing of time, it holds that idea gently, without needing to express it, without needing to be understood. And within that quiet holding, another reflection begins to form, about limits, about what the body can give and what it cannot, because the wall exists as a reminder, not only of what was built, but of what was required. And there is something important in recognizing that, not to measure it, not to compare, but simply to acknowledge that every structure, every system, every continuation rests on something that has been given: time, energy, presence, and often more than can be easily seen. And in that recognition, there is a kind of balance, a soft understanding that what remains is always connected to what is past, even if that connection is no longer visible. And as I sit with this thought, there is something else that feels clear, that stillness itself is not empty. It is full, in a different way, full of what is settled, full of what no longer needs to move, full of what has already taken its place. And in that fullness, there is no urgency, no need to add, no need to change, only a quiet acceptance of what is already there. And perhaps that is the most gentle lesson the wall offers. Not about how to build, not about how to endure, but about how to rest when the movement has passed, to allow what has been done to remain, without needing to carry it forward, without needing to return to it, simply letting it be part of the world in its own quiet way. And as this thought settles, the wall remains, the land remains, the stillness deepens, and everything that once moved to create this line becomes part of something that no longer asks to be continued, only to be present. And in that presence there is peace, not something that arrives suddenly, but something that has always been there, waiting for the moment when nothing more needs to be done. As the quiet settles more deeply, and the wall rests across the land without movement, there is space now to notice something that has been present all along. Not in the height of the structure, not in the distance it covers, but in the simple question that remains when everything else has faded. What was truly carried here? Not only earth, not only stone, but something less visible, something that moved through every step, every repetition, every quiet moment of continuation. Time, given slowly, without being held. And as I reflect on this, there is something gentle in the way time passes through us, and then settles into what remains. We move, we act, we repeat, often without seeing where those movements will rest. And yet, they do. Not always where we expect, not always in ways we return to see, but somewhere, quietly, they take form, and perhaps, in our own lives, it is often the same. The effort we give does not always stay with us. The moments we carry do not always return in the same shape, but they are not lost. They become part of something that continues without needing us to follow it. And there is something calm in that thought. Not because everything lasts forever, but because not everything needs to be held to have meaning. The wall remains, not as a memory, not as a story being told, but as a presence. And within that presence, everything that was given to it has already found its place. And as I consider this, there is something else that feels quietly true, that what we try hardest to keep is often not what remains, but what we are willing to give, without needing it to return, without needing it to stay close, without needing to see what it becomes, because those are the moments that move beyond us, that settle into something larger, something quieter, something that continues long after we have stopped moving. And in that way, what remains is not always what we held on to, but what we allowed to become part of the world without us. And as this thought settles, the wall feels different. Not distant, not separate, but connected in a quiet way to something familiar. Because it no longer stands only as a boundary, it becomes a reflection of effort that has passed, of time that has been given, of movement that no longer needs to continue in order to matter. And within that reflection, there is nothing to complete, nothing to return to, nothing to carry forward, only the quiet recognition that something has already been enough. And as the land remains still, and the wall holds its place, that understanding stays, soft, unforced, and present without needing to be held. And perhaps that is what stays with us. Not the movement, not the distance, but the quiet truth that what we give, without holding on, is what remains the longest. And in that stillness, there's nothing more to add. Only a gentle space, where everything has already found its place. As everything settles into stillness, and the wall remains as a quiet line across the land, there is nothing more that needs to be built. No movement waiting to begin. No distance left to measure. Only the presence of what already is. The earth held in place. The shape formed through time. And the quiet that follows when nothing more is asked. The wind moves softly across the surface. Light fades and returns without interruption. And the wall remains, not as something unfinished, not as something waiting, but as something that has already become what it is. And in that becoming, there is rest. Not the rest that follows effort, but the rest that exists when effort is no longer needed. And as I reflect on this final moment, there is something calm in the way everything comes back to stillness, not as an ending, but as a return, because the movement, the rhythm, the repetition, all of it was part of something that is now settled. And within that settling, there is nothing left to carry, nothing left to continue, only what remains. And now, as you rest here, you can begin to let go as well. Let the thoughts that followed the story soften. Let the images fade gently into the background. There's no need to hold them, no need to remember each part. Everything that needed to be understood has already settled quietly. Allow your breath to slow in and out without effort. Let your body become still, supported, at ease, without needing to move. The day, whatever it carried, can begin to drift away. There is nothing you need to do now, nothing you need to finish. Only this moment, quiet and complete, just as it is. And as the wall remains, without effort, without motion, you too can rest in that same stillness. Let the rhythm fade, let the distance dissolve, let everything gently come to rest. There's nowhere to go, nothing to reach, only a quiet space where everything has already arrived. And in that space, sleep can come naturally, softly, without force, without thought. Just as the wall remains, you can remain still and at peace. And now, you can close your eyes and let the quiet carry you the rest of the way.